Welcome back to LexTalks, legal topics simplified, where we try to make all this legal stuff, digestible for, all of you future lawyers in India.
Yeah.
And today we are diving deep into a pretty crucial piece of international humanitarian law,
Right.
the Geneva Convention, the third,
Yes.
with a focus on the treatment of prisoners of war.
It's really fascinating how this document kind of rose from the ashes of World War II
Yeah.
and how it still shapes, how we approach armed conflicts even today.
I was reading about some of the atrocities
Oh, yeah.
that happened in World War II.
It's hard to even fathom some of that stuff.
And it really makes you think that,
Yeah.
this isn't just some abstract
Right.
legal text.
Yeah.
It's a response to, real human suffering.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the earlier attempts, like the 1864 Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions,
Right.
those were very important steps, but they just lacked the teeth and the detailed provisions that GC3 provides.
So it's about setting clear rules and making sure that they're enforced.
Absolutely. It really lays out a comprehensive set of guidelines for how POWs should be treated, covering, everything from basic necessities and medical care to judicial protections and even communication rights.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. First off, who exactly does this convention apply to? I mean, it's about prisoners of war.
Yeah.
But, war itself has changed so much.
Yeah, modern warfare is so different from the conflicts of the past, but at its core, GC III applies to international armed conflicts. And it covers, members of the armed forces, militias, volunteer corps, those directly engaged in fighting.
Makes sense. What about those people who might get caught in the crossfire, like civilians who are supporting the armed forces in some way?
Like I'm thinking medical personnel, journalists, even those who are providing logistics support. Are they covered?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Geneva Convention 3 definitely recognizes the complexities of modern warfare.
Yeah.
And all those individuals that you mentioned, even though they're not actively fighting, they're absolutely crucial to the war effort. And so they're also entitled to protection under the convention. But it gets even more nuanced.
Okay. Here's where it gets interesting.
Right. So the 1977 Additional Protocol actually expanded the definition of POWs to include civilians who are part of organized resistance movements. So think of uprisings against occupying forces. Individuals who might not wear uniforms but are still fighting for a cause.
So the definition of combatant has kind of evolved to reflect modern conflicts.
Yeah. That line between civilian and combatant can be blurry, and the protocol acknowledges that. But that raises another question for me. What about those people who maybe would be considered unlawful combatants? Is that term even recognized by?
That's a tricky issue. The term itself actually isn't recognized by GC III.
Okay.
What's important to understand is that even if a captured individual is suspected of violating the laws of war, they're still entitled to certain fundamental protections.
So even if they've potentially committed war crimes?
Yes. Until a competent tribunal determines otherwise, they must be treated as POWs and afforded all the rights and protections outlined in the convention.
That must be a tough pill to swallow for some.
Absolutely.
Especially if those alleged crimes are, particularly heinous.
But the core principle here is that everyone, regardless of their actions, deserves humane treatment, and depriving someone of their rights without due process simply isn't acceptable.
So it's almost like innocent until proven guilty, but
exactly
in a war setting.
That's a great way to put it. That's why Article 5 of the convention is so crucial. It states that if anyone, if their POW status is in doubt, they must be treated as a POW until a proper legal determination is made.
So it's a safeguard against just arbitrarily detaining people.
Exactly.
And making sure that their basic rights aren't denied just because it's unclear.
Yeah.
So what would that legal process actually look like, in a conflict zone?
Well, the convention is very specific about the procedural guarantees that have to be in place. Think of things like a fair trial, the right to a defense protection from coercion or torture.
So it's like this mini legal system.
In a sense, yes.
Operating within the...
Trying to bring order and due process to a situation that's inherently chaotic and often brutal.
It's remarkable how the Geneva Convention, the Third, tries to balance these two things, the harsh realities of war with the need for humane treatment. It's really...
it's a delicate balance.
It is.
Yeah.
It really does make you think, okay, so we've kind of established who's covered by the Geneva Convention, the Third.
Right.
But what does that protection actually look like, when you get down to it? What are we talking about specifically?
Well, one of the most fundamental provisions is Article 13, which very clearly prohibits torture, cruel treatment, and degrading punishment.
Seems pretty straightforward. No torture, no inhumane treatment.
Right.
But I'm wondering about the more subtle forms of mistreatment. Like, are we talking psychological pressure or humiliation? Do those things fall under this?
Yeah. The convention actually takes that into account as well. Yeah. It really stresses the importance of treating POWs with respect and protecting them from, insults, public curiosity, really anything that could kind of undermine their dignity.
So no, parading them through the streets as war trophies.
Exactly. The main aim here is to preserve their inherent human dignity, even in captivity. And it actually goes beyond just prohibiting ill treatment. Oh. The convention also sets out positive obligations for the detaining power.
Like what kinds of things are we talking about?
Well, think about basic necessities. Article 15 mandates that the detaining power has to provide POWs with adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care.
So this is all free of charge?
Absolutely.
They can't be expected to, pay for this while they're prisoners?
Right. It's the responsibility of the detaining power to ensure that their basic needs are met. And it goes beyond just physical well-being.
Right.
The convention recognizes the importance of mental and emotional health as well.
I was just reading about that, Articles 69 to 74, which deal with communication. So POWs are allowed to send and receive letters and packages, which just seems so important to maintain some kind of connection to the outside world.
Exactly. The convention understands that, these individuals are still human beings.
Of course.
They have families, loved ones, and social connections. Keeping those lines of communication open is really vital for their psychological well-being.
Of course, there are probably security concerns, right? I mean, the detaining power can't just let them send whatever they want.
Of course not. There are provisions that allow for censorship of mail, but there are also safeguards in place against unreasonable delays. So it's really a balance between security concerns and the POW's fundamental right to communicate.
Finding that balance. So what happens if a POW is accused of committing a crime while they're in captivity?
Well, even in that situation, they were still entitled to certain legal protections. Articles 82 to 108 outline the judicial guarantees that must be afforded to POWs who are accused of offenses.
So even though they're prisoners of war, they still...
Absolutely. They have the right to a fair trial, the right to defend themselves, the right to call witnesses. And importantly, they can't be subjected to coercion or torture to extract confessions.
So it's almost like a mini legal system.
Kind of.
Within this larger context of war. But things must get really complicated. Who oversees all of this?
Yeah.
How do we actually make sure that these things that are on paper are actually happening?
Right. That's where this concept of a protecting power comes in.
Okay.
GC III allows for a neutral third country to be designated as a protecting power, and their whole role is to safeguard the interests of the POWs and to make sure that the detaining power is sticking to the convention's provisions.
So they're like the referees of the situation, making sure everyone's following the rules.
Exactly. They have the right to visit POW camps, interview prisoners, and then report on any violations that they might observe.
So that's a pretty crucial role.
Yeah.
What happens if, for whatever reason, there is no protecting power? Like if the conflict's really complicated or there are maybe political obstacles in the way.
Right. In those cases, the International Committee of the Red Cross, or the ICRC, often steps in.
Okay.
They have really played a vital role in upholding the Geneva Conventions in countless conflicts around the world.
The ICRC. Those folks are always on the front lines of these humanitarian crises. It's good to know there's like a backup when things get messy.
Right.
But let's be honest, modern warfare is messy, almost by definition.
Right.
So how does GC III hold up in the face of things like asymmetric warfare, terrorism, and just that blurring of lines between combatants and civilians.
Yeah, you've hit on like one of the most challenging aspects of applying the Geneva Conventions today.
Mm-hmm.
How do you take this framework that was designed for, more traditional state-on-state warfare and apply it to conflicts that are so fluid, unpredictable, and involve these non-state actors?
It's kind of like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that tension, that challenge, almost a sign that the Geneva Conventions are still relevant, that they're being tested, pushed to their limits?
I think so.
But there's still this vital framework for protecting human dignity.
Absolutely.
In the middle of all this conflict.
The world has changed so much since the Geneva Conventions were first drafted. But those core principles of humane treatment, due process, and respect for human dignity are just as relevant as ever.
And for our law students listening in India, this is where I think things get really interesting. Because you're the next generation of legal minds who are going to be grappling with these questions. Figuring out how to apply these principles in a world that's always changing. It's a challenge for sure, but it's also an incredible opportunity to shape the future of international humanitarian law.
Right.
Because let's be real. The Geneva Conventions aren't just these like static documents, right?
Oh.
They need to be interpreted and applied based on what's happening in the world.
And that's why it's so important for aspiring legal professionals like yourselves to really engage with these issues. Not just understand, what the law says, but also the spirit behind it.
Right. It's not enough to just memorize the articles and protocols.
Exactly.
You really have to grapple with the ethical dilemmas, the gray areas, the places where the law is really being pushed to its limits.
Because that's where you can really make a difference.
Right.
By, thinking critically, challenging assumptions, coming up with creative solutions that uphold human dignity, even in the most difficult situations.
It's almost like being a legal detective. Piecing together the puzzle of how do we apply these principles in a world that's constantly changing.
And one area I think where we see this playing out really clearly is in the evolving detention practices related to terrorism.
Right. We talked earlier about how the definition of combatant has expanded.
Right.
But the rise of terrorism has really muddied the waters, hasn't it?
It has.
How do you apply the Geneva Conventions to individuals who might not be part of this traditional military structure, but who are still engaging in acts of violence?
It's a question that's been debated a lot, and there's really no easy answer. On the one hand, there's a desire to make sure that anyone who's genuinely, engaged in combat is afforded the protections of POW status.
But on the other hand, there's a concern that if you broaden that definition too much, it could undermine the very distinction between combatants and civilians, which is so important. When it comes to protecting non-combatants during wartime.
And then on top of that, you have the complexities of non-state actors, these groups that operate outside the traditional framework of nation states.
Right.
How do you hold them accountable to international law? How do you make sure the Geneva Conventions are applied fairly and consistently in these situations?
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
For all of our listeners, and especially those of you who are, really passionate about international law and human rights, this is, I think, an area where your generation can make a real difference.
Absolutely. We need fresh perspectives. We need innovative thinking and a deep commitment to finding those solutions that uphold the core values of the Geneva Conventions, even as we face these new challenges.
And as future lawyers, you have this unique opportunity to do that, to use your skills and your knowledge to advocate for the vulnerable, to challenge injustice, and to really help shape a more humane and just world.
Because ultimately, that's what the Geneva Conventions are all about. It's not just about rules and regulations. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity of every human being, even when they're in the middle of a conflict.
I think that's a great place to leave it. So for all of you tuning in to LexTalks, I hope this deep dive into the Geneva Convention, the Third, has been helpful.
I hope so, too.
And remember, the learning doesn't stop here.
It doesn't.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make that difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next Lex Talks.